Good morning, good afternoon. Great, I'm just letting a couple more folks connect to audio. But we're expecting, it's a pretty small group today, so feel free to be on camera if you're comfortable, so we can make it kind of more of a dialogue and helpful for you. All right, so yeah, I'll go ahead and get started. So hello, everybody. My name is Catherine Martucci. I'm the Director of Policy and Programs at the Alliance for Health Policy, and we're pleased to have you joining us for this media briefing. If this is your first time at one of our events, welcome. The Alliance is a nonpartisan organization. We're dedicated to advancing knowledge and understanding of various health policy issues. And we also appreciate you joining what I believe is one of the first of these kinds of events that we've done either in a while and certainly virtually. So thank you for being a little bit of our guinea pigs today. But we got feedback from some of our reporter friends that they would appreciate some more in-depth events on various topics so that they can interact with the experts and ask them, quote unquote, basic questions as if there's anything basic about our healthcare system. So that's what we're bringing you today. Today's topic is balancing prescription drug innovation and affordability. And we'll begin with some opening presentations from speakers that will provide a bit of an overview of our topic today. Then they will engage in some moderated discussion with the moderator that we hope will illuminate some of the key trade-offs at hand. And then we'll open it up to questions from you all. And again, that said, we want to make this as interactive as possible. So encourage you to be on camera if you can. Please ask clarifying questions as you go. Just use the hand raise button at the bottom of your Zoom window to signal that you have a question, and then we'll unmute you. And then just to clarify for everyone, today's event is on the record, and there'll be a recording available on our website soon. And we would certainly appreciate your feedback and ideas for future reporter-focused programming. So we'll have a survey at the end of the event, and please feel free to reach out to me directly too, if you have any ideas. So then with that, I'd like to thank Arnold Ventures for their support of this briefing and for moderating today's session. So Dr. Mark Miller, he's the Executive Vice President of Healthcare at Arnold Ventures. He's bringing 30 years of experience in health policy and his work leading Arnold Ventures work to lower the cost and improve the value of healthcare. And he's held previous positions with the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission, the Congressional Budget Office, and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So definitely happy to be turning this over to your expert hands, Mark. Turn it over to you.
Thank you for that, Catherine. Just, one sentence on Arnold Ventures. We're a philanthropy. We fund work in a number of areas: criminal justice, education, and then, of course, healthcare, which brings us here today. I think the reason we're having this conversation is that the drug debate is in full operation on the Hill, and the issue of innovation and access, comes up repeatedly in that debate. So I could set it up more, but I think we all know what we're doing here. And in the interest of time and getting to your questions, ultimately, I'm just going to introduce the speakers. The speakers will do their piece, and then, as Catherine said, we'll have a couple of framing questions that they'll react to, and then we'll turn to you. So the first person that I would like, and I know both of these people and have known them for a few years, so I think you have a very good panel here in front of you. So the first, I'd like to introduce Rina Conti, who is the Associate Research Director of Biopharma and Public Policy for the Boston University Institute of Health System Innovation and Policy. She is also an associate professor at the Boston University Questrom School of Business. She has a PhD in economics from Harvard. And then the second speaker will be Benedict Ippolito, who is the senior fellow at the Economic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on public finance and health economics. Ben has his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And with that, I would ask Rena to take things over here.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Alliance, so much for today. Can we go to the next slide, please? Next slide, please. Thank you. So in the time that I have for formal remarks, I'm going to go through a couple of important topics. The first is I'm going to briefly review the empirical evidence base for supporting reform. I'm going to talk to you through the 3 principles of reform. I'm going to show you some estimates of savings from reform. And then I'm going to raise for you, but not go through in detail, because I hope that we'll discuss these in the Q&A, intended and unintended consequences and potential trade-offs. Next slide, please. So in reviewing the evidence base, all of the statements here have authors in the parens. These are all published papers. These are all trusted sources. I put them on here for your reference, and if you need a contact, please let me know. I'm happy to put you in touch. So the empirical evidence base for reform is incontrovertible. We know the launch prices of new drugs are untethered to any value benchmark. We also know that Americans paid 2 to 4 times more for drugs than in peer countries. And what is quite unique here is that the brand name prices of drugs are increasing more than 2 times inflation rates. This is very different than in other European countries where prices tend to stabilize post-launch or actually go down. There is significant financial toxicity associated with the use of these products. People are not using them as prescribed. People are cutting pills, missing pills, non-adherent to therapy, and medical debt specifically related to prescription drug costs is a multi-billion-dollar problem at this time. We also know that price increases for existing therapies do make people make decisions about whether or not they are going to continue on this therapy that is indicated or not. There are also some really good new papers by Amitabh Chandra and others at Harvard suggesting that there are real health impacts on heart disease, on cancer, and some other important chronic conditions. And then lastly, there's a recent paper that suggests that pharma companies are using profits to pursue stock buybacks rather than pursuing R&D. The order of magnitude is important. They are estimating that the 14 companies spent $600 billion on stock buybacks and dividends in the past 4 years, and only $56 billion on R&D in the same time period. Next slide, please. Why is this the case? In a word, capitalism. Monopoly power derived from market exclusivity and patents for new drugs is clearly being exercised here. This is also being done in a free pricing environment, unlike other medical care inputs, hospitalizations, doctor visits, etc. There is very limited government regulation of reimbursement for these products. This is on top of, and this is really where the corporate entitlement comes from, is significant gaming of the system to extend exclusivity, keep generics off the market, and forestall competition in other ways, including quote unquote killer acquisitions of potential competitors. And then lastly, all of this pricing behavior is taking place in an environment where basically the public payer is the most prominent payer and essentially guarantees access and coverage to all drugs that come to market regardless of their price. And for a variety of reasons, we would expect that rationing on the supply side through formularies, through other types of coverage restrictions might help restrain spending or kind of align spending with value. But here, this is a very incomplete solution because formularies don't actually work very well, and doctors have a really hard time saying no to patients, even when these therapies are not really valued. Next slide, please. The result is massive, unnecessary, and growing burden on taxpayers, consumers, and businesses. In Part D, there are very significant price or spending increases over the past decade. Next slide, please. In Medicare Part B, drug spending is doubled in the past decade, and here's where there are really no restraints on price and or on use. Next slide, please. There are other implications. Not only are taxpayers paying premiums and paying out-of-pocket costs in the public programs, this is spilling over into the commercial sector as well. We know that out-of-pocket spending is growing over time. People are underinsured for these therapies, and you're seeing this in people's desperation to have some relief from these high prices. And really, this raises a serious equity concern, which is good insurance is determining access to these drugs, and more importantly, taxpayers are funding this innovation. And so we have a situation where we are all paying into the system, where we pay the highest prices in the world, and we are guaranteeing the most robust ecosystem for innovation, and yet we can't access the products that are available now. Next slide, please. There are three principles of reform. First, a new stick negotiation to help tame prices and get them more in line with value. The second is inflation caps on year-over-year, quarter-over-quarter spending. And then lastly is a reform of insurance coverage, particularly in the public programs, to promote access to therapies that we know have value and do work, and relieve some of the pressure that patients are facing at the pharmacy counter. Next slide, please. The estimated savings from reform are very large. In total, something approximating $500 billion over the past 10 years, or the next 10 years. Much of it's coming from negotiation. Much other of it is coming from inflation. There is this misunderstanding of the importance of inflation rebates. Inflation rebates are actually doing double duty, both in straight savings, but also in Medicare negotiation. I'm happy to talk about that in more detail. Part B benefits, D benefit redesign is going to cost money on the order of approximately $9 billion over the same time period. And depending on the bill or the reform proposals that you see, a redesign of patent or stopping of forestalling of competition might be on the table. You can see here that estimated savings is approximately $500 million. The magnitude of savings here is important. It will come back up later in our discussion. And Part D, rebates or PBM reform is actually going to increase spending. Again, important for our discussion later. Next slide, please. Lastly, you should know that Medicare negotiation is extremely popular. It is bipartisan in its support, both in terms of parties and real people. Next slide, please. If you have watched TV or any sporting event in the past couple of months, you will see that the ratchet up of ads on both sides belying public interest here. Some of the ads that are very negative are using scare tactics. There are two. One is on innovation. We'll talk about that in the Q&A, but the other one is on rationing, and specifically using or raising the specter of people not being able to get drugs now that they need. This is not really reflective of any of the bills that we are aware of or proposals that are on the table. Next slide, please. I'm going to end with a couple of issues that will likely come up. The first is on this trade-off around pricing relative to innovation. Second is cost shifting onto the commercial side for both existing and potentially new drugs that would come to market, depending on how the parliamentarian rules on whether these reforms can be extended to the commercial side. Cost shifting onto international payers, impacts on hospitals and clinics, in part because they make money off the high prices of drugs, particularly for drugs that are covered under the medical benefit. And then there are a variety of technical issues on the benchmark prices, on how do you cap beneficiary out-of-pocket costs, exactly how beneficiaries are going to benefit from these, that I hope we will discuss in our Q&A. With that, I will stop and leave it to Benedict.
Thank you for that, Rena, and that was a lot to put into your time, and I really appreciate you bringing all that to the table. Benedict, on to you.
All righty, thank you. I guess, Catherine, you've got the controls. So, so I was asked to talk just a little bit about the drug development process and how that fits in with some of the policy questions that Rena certainly alluded to. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. This is not, just for clarity, this isn't really intended to be an argument for or against any specific policy, but hopefully to sort of tee up what I suspect are some of the questions we'll talk about. So let's get started then. And next slide, please. So I think a lot of people know, at least at a high level, that drug development, like a lot of other investment in other industries, is not unique. It's a costly process, right? So it takes a while and it takes a bunch of money. And part of that is because you do have to go through this somewhat unique process of actually getting approved. And so that bakes in a certain amount of time. And so when you think about this process in terms of ballpark figures to have in mind, it can often take something on the order of a decade to get from relatively early stage drug discovery type work to actually having a product on the shelf. And depending on the paper you look at, we're talking hundreds of millions or very low billions. When I say very low billions, I mean like literally $1 or $2 billion, right? Those are ballpark numbers. There's always going to be tons of variation, but just for sort of level setting. And when we talk about the pharmaceutical industry, I do think it's actually worth noting that the industry has actually evolved kind of a lot in recent history. I think a lot of us know big pharma firms as they're known, so things like Merck and Pfizer and GSK and all these sort of household names, right? They certainly play a very large role in this industry, but increasingly there's this role played by smaller firms, often these biotech firms. And somewhat interestingly, the industry is sort of bifurcated. The larger firms increasingly focus on drug development, and they do less of the earlier stage investment in-house, where a lot of these smaller firms are specializing more in that earlier stage investment. And so the reason I bring this up is in part just to emphasize that these things are linked. Oftentimes those small firms are aiming to be actually acquired by larger firms down the road. And so the reason I mention that is just because this is something that seems to be acknowledged by policymakers. You're starting to see proposals where they sort of carve out certain parts of the industry versus others. I would encourage you just to at least know to ask about how to think about these things, given the fact that they are kind of intrinsically linked. That doesn't mean you should or shouldn't do policy X, Y, or Z, but it means that they are related. Oh, next slide, please. So there's a private industry. I think we all know about this private industry. Of course, public policy plays a huge role in drug development, very directly and then very indirectly. And so I'm going to start with the direct role. And that's next slide, please. So the government funds research, right? This extremely direct way through which the federal government affects the drugs that we get, the development that we see in the US and across the globe, right? So the federal government, mostly through the NIH, spends billions of dollars every year on drugs. Relative to the private sector, it prioritizes basic research much more than the private sector does. The private sector by itself does very little basic research. And when I say basic research, I mean research that doesn't necessarily have like an immediate commercial application. But these things can be extremely important to drug development. Learning things about how conditions work or progress, or how the body reacts to certain things, or the body works. Those are very important to understanding or developing drugs eventually, right? So we see a lot of drugs come to market. In fact, essentially every drug comes to market, and there's typically government-funded research, often in the very earliest stages, and it's often this basic research that we tend to see them prioritize. So that's sort of the most direct role, I guess I would say. And if we move forward, the government also plays I mean, you can call it indirect. It's still so important, it almost seems ridiculous to call it indirect, but they play an indirect role in the sense that the government affects the financial returns that a firm gets for making a drug. And it does it in a bunch of ways. And so we can move forward a slide. And I'll emphasize two. And Rena certainly alluded to these in her remarks. So drugs have certain periods for which they do not have direct competitors, right? And some of those things are drug specific and some of them aren't. So drugs, like other innovations, or other new products, I should say, can file for patents. All right, that's not unique to the drug market. It's very important for the drug market, but it's not unique to the drug market. If you have a novel and non-obvious extension of prior art, I believe is the term, then you can apply to the US Patent and Trade Office and they can give you a patent protection for that specific innovation. The FDA also grants exclusivity. And this is unusual. This is not something that we see in other markets, right? So this is saying no matter what's going on with your patents, no matter if they're going to expire or anything like that, the FDA says once you get to the end of that approval process, we're going to agree that I'm not going to approve any exact copy of your drug for a certain number of years. And so depending on the kind of drug you're talking about, that exclusivity period varies quite a bit. For a lot of drugs, it might be 5 years. So those are sort of traditional small molecule drugs. For many biologics, it's 12 years. And then there's some variation for various subcategories within there. All right, that obviously has a huge impact on what you're going to make when you bring a drug to market because it affects whether somebody's going to be able to copy the thing. The second way, of course, is like Rena said, the government buys drugs, like directly buys drugs, right? We have programs like Medicare, we have Medicaid, we have other things like the VA, we have Department of Defense, direct federal purchasers. All these people are purchasing drugs. How much they're willing to pay for those drugs has an obvious first order implication for how much you're going to make if you bring a drug to market. And so if we move forward, one slide, we get to sort of this key policy trade-off, which is we know that these kinds of decisions affect the returns that a drug maker gets when they bring a drug to market. And we know directionally that that has some effect. If returns are higher, we expect manufacturers to invest more in drugs. The big question, and what underpins all of the policy, what I'll call the substantive policy debates, is, well, how big is that effect? Right? We have some idea of how big that effect might be, but how many drugs is this specific policy going to change? What is the composition of the drugs that we're going to get under this new policy relative to the status quo? Are we going to see lots fewer low-value drugs, or are we going to see lots fewer high-value drugs? Well, the answer to that question is really important. And that's where I think I think it's fair to say that the empirical evidence can only tell us so much. We just only have so much empirical evidence historically, and we're going to have to involve some level of theory in predicting these kind of things. And so as I think about the core, again, substantive policy debate, I think of it this way. I think basically as society, most of us care about two groups of people. We care about what Rena's talking about. Like, it's a problem that we have to spend a bunch of money on drugs at the federal level because it crowds out other priorities that we care about. Like, we care about schools and infrastructure. That crowds out that spending, right? It creates financial challenges. It creates access problems. It has health consequences. Those are clear problems, and we care about those problems, right? We also care about people who have conditions that don't have great treatments. We care about people with Alzheimer's. That's not, I know there is an industry version of this argument, but ignoring the industry version of this argument, we as society care about that, and we want there to be some innovation there. And so the question is, how do we balance those two things? And so if we go to the last slide, the key point that I want to end on is that even if you think that trade-off is important, that doesn't mean that everything should stay the same. And that, I think, is an important distinction. There is an industry that would like everything to stay the same or money to go up, right? They use this argument to say don't do anything. But if you think this is an important trade-off, that does not necessarily imply everything is great. The way I think about it is that it changes how people's policy preferences might come out, right? So how big of a change do you think we should have in terms of drug spending? How much should we reduce drug spending? How quickly should we do it? Should it be an incremental change, or should it be a change that happens sort of immediately? If you want to prioritize, if you put more weight on access issues, on federal spending, on out-of-pocket expenditure issues, you might say, well, yeah, a large, broad, immediate reduction has huge benefits. if you put more weight on these innovation concerns, you might say, well, I might be more cautious and say I'd love to start with targeted reforms that aim at places where I think spending is particularly low value right now, and maybe aim to increase those over time as you learn more about that, right? So the key point I want to make is that even if you think this is an important trade-off, that does not imply you shouldn't do anything, but it might imply that people have genuinely different policy preferences. And so I think I'll just end there and look forward to the questions. Thank you for having me, by the way.
Okay, I really appreciate that. And there's a couple of things that were said that I think segue right into what I'm going to do at this point. So the first thing I want to do is remind the reporters on the call that you can start formulating your questions and getting ready to raise your hands electronically, which I don't know how to do, but I'm going to assume you know how to do. And while you're formulating that, I just want to frame things a little bit, much of which the two speakers have done, but just maybe in a more summary way. In particular, right at the end there, where Benedict was talking about, status quo or change. I mean, I think that's really important that, the big breaking news, as it turns out, is like no policy is actually very perfect. And so when people start proposing changes, people, rightfully attack and raise questions about policy. But it's really also important in my mind and through my career to remember that status quo is not necessarily perfect either. And so there are trade-offs there. And so I tended, and particularly at MedPAC, to think about things in terms of principles and trade-offs, and to try and focus this a little bit. There's a few, and I think they have been touched on here, but let me just bring them right to the top of the heap here. So there is research, and here, Rena and Benedict, I'm thinking about the Dranoff NBER paper. I absolutely believe that spending is related to innovation, and you could spend so little that innovation could be effective. But I also think the other important thing that has come out of that research is that there were situations where large revenue infusions to the industry occurred. You got more drugs, but most of those drugs were in classes that already had 5 drugs. And so the first kind of trade-off is innovation versus more drugs. So that's one trade-off. And I'm just going to tick a few of these off. You pick and choose, maybe make some comments, and then we'll segue into the reporters. The second thing, which I think comes out in this conversation, is we have, I'm going to pick the Kaiser stuff, that 29% of the population that is basically rationing drugs, either not taking them or splitting them or whatever the case may be. And then there's this other argument, which is, yes, but there's potential for innovation in the future. How do we think about that trade-off, and where would you land on that? The third thing I think that, people, kind of puzzle through is, if, the one argument, if you reduce revenues, then you're going to lose innovation, but a fair pile of evidence that suggests there's revenue out there, but it's not necessarily all being directed to R&D. There's revenue in the big pharma companies that Benedict has referred to, and then there's government revenue. There are other places that revenue can come from, we can get into in a conversation. But if there is this, if there's this much revenue that's not being devoted to R&D, then why is it so critical that if some reduction in revenue occurs, all the wheels are going to come off innovation? And that's kind of a hard, kind of thing to think through. And the very last thing I'll say is, are there different ways to think about the innovation model? I mean, the vaccine stuff, the government was very involved in and was buying drugs up front and de-risking the situation, and the innovation occurred very, very quickly. And so, does the model, it may be that certain drugs our model works for very well, and other drugs a different model would work. It's like, do we have to stick to the same model? So what I'd like to do here is just, in a sense, give the two speakers an opportunity to expand on their comments and perhaps ideally down one of these lanes. And then we'll flip to the reporters. But of course, you two, can do what you're going to do. But that's what I was trying to set up here.
Do you
Go
want?
ahead.
Okay, thank you. So on the innovation, more versus better comment, I would say two things. The first is that all the empirical evidence we have about this trade-off between increasing revenue or decreasing revenue and more drugs or less drugs is based on relative changes in revenue from one product category to another. And just to be really clear here, so most of the evidence is looking at changes in R&D that happened from the Part D program. And that was a relative change. All it basically did was underwrite the purchases of prescription drugs for seniors in a different way than it had been before. And what they find is when you lower the price for seniors and you expand that market, lo and behold, revenue flows into drugs that meet that market. What that evidence does not tell us what that evidence does not tell us, however, is if we radically change the prices of these products, how would innovation flow? All it tells us is the relative emphasis of drugs in one category to meet one group of consumers relative to another. And so we know that if we alter the incentives here for investment, well, that money has other uses. That money will flow into the uses that will make the most revenue for these companies. So the other thing I would say here is that we know really life-changing innovation when we see it. There are great examples of drugs that have come to market that have radically changed people's lives. They have improved the longevity and also improved and really converted dread disease into chronic illness. Some great examples, the DAAs that essentially cure hepatitis C, Gleevec and the other TKIs that converted leukemia into being a chronic illness. There are many others, those are my favorite. Many of the drugs that come to market are not those drugs. In fact, the majority of the drugs that come to market in any given year are not those drugs. Instead, what we have are a lot of drugs that are Me Too, that are reformulations of the same thing, or something that kind of exhibits product hops where it's kind of a slightly different molecule that's been reformed in some way. Those may have benefits to some consumers, but really what these are ways of forestalling generic and biosimilar competition from coming to market. And so when we think about Me Too, or when we think about those potential lost drugs, the kind of general answer is, okay, well, we may not actually be losing that much from potential changes in revenue that would feed back to losing products. I think the only other thing I would add to Mark's comments is that a lot of people would like to downplay the role that government plays in development of new drugs as opposed to research of new drugs. You heard Benedict mention this. But government actually plays an incredibly important role in developing these new products, in supporting the research infrastructure in Cambridge and other places that bring emerging products to market and sustain them. And it's not just in guaranteeing market exclusivities or in reimbursement on the other end, it's actually in supporting manufacturing. in supporting clinical trials that are more cost effective to do, or even underwriting those trials. And so one of the things that I think is important about the proposals on the table is that there is spending that is earmarked or proposed. Some of the savings from the pricing reform would go back into NIH dollars. Some of that NIH dollars is not for research, for basic science. It's actually for development. And here's where policymakers could even go further if they wanted to underwrite really risky development for products that we think are really going to transform people's lives in the development phase, not in necessarily the research phase. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, so the question you bring up about, we talk about, like Rena was talking about, we kind of focus on like the number of new drugs, and we focus on the things we do, in part because we have like measurement problems. We can only measure what we can measure in some ways, and like there's only so many things happen in life. There's only so many policy changes we can investigate. And there's only so many things we can measure. And so we are kind of stuck in this imperfect world where we do talk a lot about, probably too much about, the number of drugs, right? The composition of drugs could be much more important than the number of drugs, right? It's totally plausible. I don't know that that's the case for every policy, but it totally could be, right? But it's a harder thing to quantify. It's a harder thing to measure. And so part of it is we can speak to what we can speak to. And so I think we are a little bit stuck there. I do think that is one of the cases where you sort of have to blend. I wouldn't call it art and science, but theory and empirics maybe. And this is one of those cases where like different people look at the same policy and have different questions, right? So one of the questions that gets brought up about HR3, for example, or some of the Medicare negotiation conversations is, how would that affect composition? And different people have different expectations. Rena was sort of saying, well, or I think Rena was implying, I apologize if I'm misstating, but was it sort of implying that like, well, if you're in that position, you can start to maybe think about price value stuff in a more explicit way. There's an alternative issue there, right? Which is how do those programs prioritize what gets negotiated? Well, things that are big budget hits are typically identified as being more important for negotiations, right? And so you might worry, well, the flip side of that is, geez, if I want to avoid being sucked into the rate setting process, well, maybe I want to make something that treats a smaller population, or maybe I want to be the third to market drug, right? So the point I'm making is that when you get into those composition questions, which are really important, that ultimately is, I think, the place where we have to get away from some of the explicit empirical estimates we have in the literature, and we need to start basically kind of estimating what we think is going to happen based on sort of common sense. And so that's a long way of saying that really important question. It's tough. You brought up the question about the vaccine development process. That reminds me of one of the things that I do think is underappreciated in this field, where we talk a lot about price, understandably, right? Part of the reason we talk about price is because it's expensive to get these things to market, right? So an example of something that can really be helpful and save you a bunch of innovation on this price stuff is thinking about the cost of development. What did we do in vaccines? We tried to homogenize trials. We tried to make things go faster. We tried to make it easier to go through that process, right? What does that do? That lowers the explicit cost of doing it. It lowers the cost of capital. It lowers the time horizon you have to think about, right? What does that do? That essentially buys you sort of some price reductions, right? That buys you some price cuts that don't necessarily have as big of an innovation effect. So that's one of the lessons that I took away from the COVID experience, is that maybe we don't think quite enough about that side of the picture.
Okay, I'm gonna jump to the reporters. I think we have a hand up for Joyce. If you would like to jump.
Sure, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I actually have two questions. One is kind of, I'd be interested in both your perspectives, what you see as the appetite for making these changes. You might think if having Medicare negotiate is going to save money, that then you get a lot of people wanting to jump on that bandwagon, but it doesn't seem like that's totally the case. And secondly, I wanted to ask about the other end of the market, the drugs that are in shortage. They're really cheap, but companies can't make up much of a profit on them. And so then we're like constantly on the verge of running out of them. And so I'm wondering what can be done to incentivize that end of the market.
Maybe I'll begin and say the status quo where people really are splitting pills and choosing between groceries and drugs is really untenable. And much of the contours of reform are bipartisan supported. In fact, much of negotiation was proposed under the Trump administration. So I would say the appetite for reform and doing something is great given the preponderance of the issue and the salience of the issue now. What politicians do or don't do, I have no opinion of. It's above my pay grade. On shortages, you're right. This is an incredibly important issue, and actually, given the labor and trade disruptions that we experienced in COVID, our drug supply is actually remarkably resilient. So that tells you that the disruptions that we saw with COVID, but much of them are actually pre-existing problems in the shortages of existing drugs, and they're persistent. And so the market is broken on that side. The White House report on American manufacturing, I think, does a nice job of starting to outline what could be done. And here, I think shoring up supply, both nearshoring, but also onshoring some product manufacturing makes some sense. And it's actually transparency on quality as well. What's interesting is that pricing, actually increasing the price of those products, is not on the table as being a reform, at least prominently so. And so that tells you that it's not just price that's driving innovation or driving supply of these products. It's other incentives that could be used to play as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so for the areas of agreement question, I mean, this has been sort of an odd element of the last, I guess, I don't know, 6 years or whatever, which is that what the Trump administration seemed to be interested in doing seemed to at times not totally mesh with what congressional members of the same party seemed to be interested in doing when it came to the drug market. And so it does create this kind of odd question of like, what is the appetite? Well, it's like, I don't know. In some ways it seems sort of bipartisan. In some ways it seems like, I don't know. And you talk to folks on the Hill and they don't seem super interested. I will say from like my own personal experience in this space, there is this frustrating element of how Congress inevitably works. And this isn't a comment about any particular party, but yeah, there's a whole bunch of things in the drug space that people really do agree on. Like we've said forever, everyone's been agreeing that like, man, the way Medicare prescription drug benefit works seems pretty screwy. We ought to fix that. And everybody's got a reform that's like so close that it's like trivial, you know, compared to the normal disagreements that we have in this space. And so you're sitting here saying like, geez, why can't we actually just get this passed? But there are areas like that. There's certainly areas surrounding some of the issues that Rena talked about with generic entry, right? Generic entry is a good example of how you can use some of these tactics to sort of introduce what was often called incremental or follow-on innovation, which it's not the follow-on innovation that's the problem. It's that the follow-on innovation means that you can maintain the same level of pricing power of the original product plus whatever you've added to it, right? If you just got to price the incremental innovation, well, that wouldn't be such a bad thing. But the fact that you get to retain all of the pricing power from the original product really represents a problem. And I think that kind of thing seems like it resonates pretty broadly when it comes to things like Medicare negotiation. There's certainly quite a bit of disagreement still on the Hill, it seems anyway.
And just a couple comments, and I want to acknowledge that Jill was on deck. So just a couple quick comments, and then I'm going to jump to Jill. I think it's important to remember that there's HR 3 and then the old Senate bill from 2019, and it's important to keep in mind that Part D reform, the inflation rebate, there does seem to be consensus. You can argue about the specifics, but some consensus around that. And then I think Benedict's comment is relevant here. It's like most of the flashpoint is around the negotiation process. I also think something that Rena said is worth reinforcing as well, that there is some consensus that there's a problem here. Even pharma comes to the table and says, limit the cost sharing for the consumer. And of course, their solution is then the taxpayer and the employer and everybody else's premiums pay for that. And I think the flashpoint for pharma is that the other solutions, do lower the consumer's cost, but then lower the revenue for pharma in the process. And that's a very central part of the debate. On the shortage thing, I have two economists on the screen, so this is highly risky. But the way innovation is supposed to work is, you get you get a high price and you get a monopoly from the government through the patent. Then after you have that run, the competitors should enter and the price gets driven down. And then when you hit that shortage point, it should be that the price begins to go back up and you draw people back into the market, but you won't return to the real high spiked monopoly price. But that doesn't always work, and it doesn't always work in a timely way. And I think some things that are happening is people, the non-traditional actors, are beginning to enter that market, like the hospitals, and starting to manufacture or create manufacturing space in order to go, at some of these low cost but essential drugs. But it's definitely an issue. Okay, I'm sorry for that interruption. Jill, how about you, Jill?
Hi, thanks for listening to me. I assume you can hear me.
Yeah.
I think it was Rena who mentioned three main options: the negotiation for Medicare, inflation caps, and copay caps. Do you think those last two are more palatable politically? There's so much attention about Medicare price negotiations, and that really gets farmers back up. But would the other two options, the caps, be somewhat effective and more politically feasible in the next few months?
So again, the politics are above my pay grade, but I will say that there is more bipartisan support for those last two proposals, inflation rebates and or caps, and Part D redesign, maybe Part B redesign as well. But negotiation is incredibly important. And that's because there is literally, our system literally has no ability to say no. And the pricing of these products is now greater than 4 years of a very fancy private college education. It's really untenable. It's making families and payers make decisions not based on value or based on efficacy, but based on other things. And so having an ability to say no, or at least having an ability to have a conversation about value, seems important. The commercial insurers are already moving in this direction, but the largest payer is the federal government, and the federal government is essentially handicapped from having any conversation about value. And so that seems to be a very important pillar of reform, regardless of whether it's going to be doing much of the heavy lifting on savings.
Yeah, I guess I'll add. I mean, again, I'm not a political commentator, but but I think just like empirically, you can look around at what kind of policies seem to get more or less support, and like what Rena's saying kind of resonates with me, which is like certainly, redesigning the Medicare program, the Part D program certainly has gotten support for forever. It seems like, and it seems like the more targeted version of a intervention that you propose, the more likely it seems to be to get broader support. So things that target, generic entry issues tend to get more support. But even interestingly, we just saw debate or ongoing debate in the House amongst Democrats about what kind of Medicare negotiation should there or shouldn't there be. And so some of the so-called the moderate Democrats proposed an idea where they said, well, what if we just targeted it to cases where we really think the market isn't doing very well, where we think that we kind of have perpetual monopolies? And to me, that sort of fits with this general sense. Again, this is not a political prediction or something like that, but general sense that it seems like there's a little bit more support for more targeted interventions where you can make a particularly compelling case that, like, boy, this is a case where value seems to really be diverging from prices. So
Benedict, and I'm not a, what did you say, political pundit or something like that, but I think the thought process of is there a discussion that should focus on drugs that have long passed their patent date and have been on been a monopoly for a long period of time, and have engaged, and many instances have engaged in building patent thickets, pay for delay, that type of thing. I have heard that thread of the conversation out there. I don't know where it all lands, but I have definitely heard that thread of a conversation.
Right, and I think conceptually it kind of makes sense in the sense that we're all sitting here saying, like, well, I mean, even if you think about the dynamics, even if you're like a huge markets kind of person, right? The dynamics of a world where you say that you kind of create these subsets where you can get these perpetual monopolies, well, you're really going to drive investment towards those perpetual situations. And so that could even mean, I know some people talk about this with orphan drugs or orphan conditions or small population drugs. We want investment there, but do we want everyone investing in just small indications because they know they'll never get a generic entry down the road, right? That's the kind of incentive that seems like it's one of these cases where you're thinking about targeted versions of this that maybe plausibly is a bit more palatable for a broader set of political offices.
I have one thing to add there, which is, if this was only a competition problem, I think that there might be, there would be more bipartisan support, or at least I would say it would be less controversial. I think part of the challenge, however, with reforming patents or reforming market exclusivity is that we inadvertently bump into trade problems or trade issues. And we also inadvertently bump into other tech sectors that have their own interests in not touching market exclusivities or patents. And so it's really important that the system find both ways to encourage competition on both the pricing side and on these other potential market reforms.
Okay, we have an anonymous question, which makes all of this very mysterious, and I'm quite, I didn't see this turn coming. Dr. Conti mentioned PBM reform would cost money, not generate savings. Please explain, would PBM reform restrict important access?
Yeah, so essentially what is on the table for PBM reform is that there would be some of the price concessions that the PBMs get for formulary placement of drugs would flow back into consumers. That means that consumers would face lower out-of-pocket costs, and that would increase demand and utilization of products. Lower price, demand shifts out, in other words. And so that reform is estimated to cost approximately $177 billion if instituted in Part D alone, and wouldn't actually touch the massive rebates that are flowing through the Part B program that beneficiaries, it wouldn't change this at all. So it costs money to reduce the out-of-pocket costs, and there is no offset there.
Benedict, did you want to comment there?
I don't know that I have a comment specifically on the question. I mean, I think the broader point is a legitimate issue, which is like the pricing dynamics in this market are insane, right? Like when you go to the hospital, you don't pay your out-of-pocket expenditure as a function of the charge master price that the hospital chooses to set. And so like that whole dynamic of list to net spreads and things like that, I think it's reasonable to be sympathetic to policies that try and impose some rationality to that. But ultimately, if in this case, like the rebate rule, I guess we're talking about the rebate rule. It's like, the rebates that you get in today's market are ex post sales. And so they're realized sales. And so we're sure about how much drug went out the door. The manufacturer is sure about how much they're willing to pay you. If they have to pay you that up front, they're going to make an expectation and they're probably not going to want to overshoot. And I think that's a lot of where the cost is coming from, is that the rebates aren't quite as high under that model. But I don't know. I'm personally sympathetic to trying to do something to rationalize that stuff, but it does cost money.
Yeah, I mean, I am for altering the allocation of rebates here too, or changing some of how the system works. It is very complicated. It causes a lot of people to be invested in.
It also like, I think it's underappreciated. It unwinds community rating, right? That's part of what's happening, right? Is that we do all this stuff to make it so that premiums can't vary based on your health status. For those who don't know, community rating means everyone pays a similar premium. And then we do this thing with drugs where we say, but if you take an expensive drug, we're going to really shovel a bunch of the out-of-pocket costs onto you, and we're going to use that to lower premiums for everybody else. So what are you doing? You're transferring money from the well to the sick. Well, we just went through this whole thing to make it so the premiums were similar, and now we're just unwinding it. And so it is one of these actual cases where it's like, it does kind of feel like it's, I do wonder whether that's like in the insurer's interest, who's really driving that or not. But anyway, I do think that's an underappreciated element of that whole list to net stuff that maybe doesn't get quite enough emphasis. But that wasn't the question. So
No, but I see the direction that you went, and I think you put your finger, both of you put your finger on, well, the rebates help you reduce premiums, and then Benedict and there's an implicit transfer between two different populations there that could be, arguably undesirable. So I think, it turns out, this involves trade-offs, and it's complicated. I do think at a minimum, in the PBM space, a much greater degree of transparency. And what's kind of shocking to me is given the level of consolidation, that even insurers who are purchasing, through PBMs don't feel like they have a ton of control over the PBM and a ton of insight into the PBM. And then you see these various consolidations with PBMs with pharmacy, PBM with insurers, and sort of what the implications of all of that are. We're actually got a study that we're trying to unpack that. But we're down to a minute, so maybe I'll say to Benedict and Rena, like any last, thing that you want to get off your chest.
There's so much.
Yeah, there's so much in a minute. So maybe I'll withdraw the question and say, Catherine, I think we're at time. I don't know how to end things. What would you like?
I appreciate it. No, I just wanted to thank everyone again. Really appreciate it. And to please send us your feedback. We want to make sure that reporter briefings are as helpful for you all as possible. So please let us know. And that we have 2 more reporter briefings coming up this month, one on October 20th on the No Surprises Act. And then October 25th, we are hosting a conversation with Dr. Seshamani of CMS, our Director of Center for Medicare. So with that, we will end. And thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to the speakers and to Mark.
Thank you so much. Great conversation.
Guys. And please feel free to send along any questions that folks have. My email's on the internet, so you can find me.
Perfect.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you all.